Today is January the 9th, 2024. There's an awful lot of people on blue tick Twitter and those political commentators trying to make something with regard to what President Biden does say, what he doesn't know, etc., etc. Really childish, just irrelevant commentary. But interestingly enough, if we go back to January the 9th, 2023, how come those same people making all of these observations seem to have forgotten when Stacey Plasket, Jamie Raskin, Dan Goldman literally obliterated Jim Jordan's hearing? It was a hearing into weaponization of blah, 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 something or else, and it was a total disaster for Jim Jordan. Not the first time, you say. Just strangely, the Trumpy Trumps and Elon Musk donators seem to have conveniently forgotten.
Nobody disputes the important role of congressional oversight. I know firsthand how important it is to ask questions and demand answers of the federal government. In the ordinary course of business, that work informs the legislative process. In extraordinary times, when misconduct in the executive branch threatens to undermine our democratic institutions, congressional oversight can serve to protect the integrity of our republic. For example, I'm proud of the role I played as an impeachment manager in the second impeachment of President Donald Trump in the aftermath of the attack on the Capitol. That bipartisan work was both a measure of accountability and a sign to the American people that Congress had no intention of being bullied into giving up on a peaceful transfer of power. But there is a difference, my colleagues, between legitimate oversight and weaponization of Congress and our processes, particularly our committee work, as a political tool. I'm deeply concerned about the use of this select subcommittee as a place to settle scores, showcase conspiracy theories, and advance an extreme agenda that risk undermining Americans' faith in our democracy. Some of today's witnesses would have us believe that the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation are part of a deep state cabal. One even wrote a book describing the FBI itself as a threat to democracy. The Department of Justice and the FBI do not always get it right. History is full of examples of these agencies getting it very, very wrong. We have colleagues in this Congress who have been subject to politically motivated, hateful, racist investigations by our government. That does not logically follow that every investigation or criminal inquiry by the FBI or the Department of Justice is political or ideologically based. But in our current climate, with domestic terrorism on the rise and hate speech normalized by national politicians, the Department of Justice and the FBI are doing their best to protect us from sliding into chaos. This past Monday, the FBI captured two individuals, one a neo-Nazi leader and founder of an Anti-Waffen group who were plotting a racially motivated attack on Baltimore's power grid. They said their goal was to, quote, completely destroy this whole city, end quote. Last week, the FBI infiltrated and disrupted a major cyber criminal group extorting schools, hospitals, and critical infrastructure around the world. And last summer, the FBI engaged in a mass violent crime enforcement effort that took nearly 6,000 violent criminals off of our American streets. Let's not forget the tremendous work of the FBI and the Department of Justice after the attacks on our homeland on September 11th, 2001. Some of my Republican colleagues love to talk about the threat of violent crime, but they appear oblivious to the fact that their dangerous rhetoric and baseless accusations against the Justice Department and FBI itself at times pose a direct threat to those organizations' ability to do the work that they are doing to protect our communities. Recent threat bulletins have highlighted a shocking increase in threats of violence against law enforcement agencies and a significant uptick after the FBI executed a search warrant at President Trump's property at Mar-a-Lago. The Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association has vehemently denounced what he described as, quote, politically motivated threats that are unprecedented in recent history and absolutely unacceptable, end quote. Unfortunately, examples of these threats are not hard to find. Last year, someone threatened to plant a dirty bomb outside the FBI headquarters. Another attempted to storm the Cincinnati FBI field office while wearing body armor and carrying an AR-type rifle. A third was arrested after he made a credible threat, stating, quote, "Every single piece of expletive who works for the FBI in any capacity, from the director on down to the janitor who cleans their expletive toilets, deserve to die. You've declared war on us, and now it's open season on you," end quote. These allegations are deeply troubling, and I hope that the chairman and members of this subcommittee will be mindful of the risks that go hand in hand with heated rhetoric. A rush to accusations and subpoenas without a factual basis and without any effort to engage with agencies through the accommodation process flies in the face of due process and demeans congressional oversight process. It makes a mockery of our institution. As a former prosecutor, I'm even more troubled by the suggestion that the subcommittee may attempt to investigate ongoing criminal investigations. As the head of the Reagan Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel wrote years ago, granting Congress access to information about active criminal investigations will, in effect, make Congress a partner in the investigation, creating a, quote, "substantial danger that congressional pressures will influence in the course of the investigation," and potentially, quote, "hamper prosecutorial decision-making in future cases." This would not only damage law enforcement efforts, it would shake the public's confidence in the criminal justice system. I hope not, but I suspect much of the investigations the majority, my Republican colleagues, want to look into and potentially muck up involve criminal investigations into former President Donald Trump. I want to be crystal clear. My Democratic colleagues and I will resist any attempt by this subcommittee to derail ongoing legitimate investigations into President Trump, any other president, and others within his orbit. During the course of this subcommittee's work, I suspect we will hear both members and witnesses describe the events of January 6, 2021 in ways that simply do not mesh with reality. When this happens, I would encourage everyone watching today to review the impeachment record and report of the January 6 Select Committee, which lays out the true facts in shocking detail. I recently sent a letter to the chairman noting that, despite our policy and political differences, I am hopeful that there may be matters of investigation within the stated mandate of the subcommittee under which we may collaborate. I meant this. I mean this. And I still hope that we can find common ground and explore it in a bipartisan manner that respects the due process rights and interests of all involved. The chair and his colleagues continually use the moniker of protecting free speech. That sounds good. I hope they all recognize that there is speech that is not constitutionally protected: racist, hate, incitement to violence. And I also hope, and if the protection of true speech, of free speech, extends to all Americans. We'll see. I hope that we can use this subcommittee to conduct legitimate oversight to help advance policies to address the real challenges that Americans face every day, rather than undermine every agent, officer, and prosecutor on the job. Government abuses of power do not solely rest with the executive branch. It can, and we've seen it come from the legislative branch as well. On our present course, however, this exercise seems little more than a political stunt designed to inject extremist politics into the legislative oversight function and the
Statement Constitution. They wanted government to operate on the basis of facts, science, and common sense, not ignorance and superstition. They wanted America to usher in an age of reason. With the separation of powers, the framers constitutionalized Newton's third law of motion, checking every action with an equal and opposite reaction. And Congress in Article 1 was given the central role of legislating and making progress for our people. The oversight function is not specified in Article 1, but the Supreme Court has always said that it's implied, something necessary and proper for the legislative function. As Madison famously said, those who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. Dear colleagues, your subcommittee could conceivably become part of a proud history of serious bipartisan oversight stretching from the Teapot Dome investigation to the Boeing investigation, to the Watergate hearings, to the tobacco hearings, to the Select Committee on the January 6th attack. Or it could take oversight down a very dark alley filled with conspiracy theories and disinformation, a place where facts are the enemy and partisan destruction is the overriding goal. Millions of Americans already fear that weaponization is the right name for this special subcommittee. Not because weaponization of the government is its target, but because weaponization of the government is its purpose. What's in a name? Well, everything is here. The odd name of the weaponization subcommittee constitutes a case of pure psychological projection. When former President Donald Trump and his followers accuse you of doing something, they're usually telling you exactly what their own plans are. By establishing a select subcommittee on weaponization, they're telling us that Donald Trump's followers, who obviously control the subcommittee, will continue weaponizing any part of the government they can get their hands on to attack their enemies, defined as anyone who stands in the way of their quest for power. To be clear, that's not an exclusively partisan operation. They've proven that they will weaponize the government not just against the other party, but against anyone who refuses to bend to the will and whim of one Donald Trump, whether that's a lifelong Republican state election official like Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, a foreign head of state like President Zelensky, a political movement like Black Lives Matter, a once close personal friend and ally of Trump's like his personal lawyer Michael Cohen for many years, or even a sycophantic Trump cabinet appointee and lifelong Republican like Attorney General William Barr, if these people break from the habits of lying and lawlessness that define life as a camp follower in the cult of Donald Trump. But if the weaponized MAGA campaign isn't exactly partisan, it is entirely political because it's got an overriding electoral focus, and you know what it is. It's all about restoring Donald Trump, the twice impeached former president, to the office he lost by 7 million votes in 2020 and tried to steal back in a political coup and violent insurrection against our constitutional order on January 6, 2021. You disagree? Well, please don't take my word for it. As our chairman might say, just listen to what Chairman Jordan himself had to say 6 months ago at the Conservative Political Action Conference in Dallas, where he was predicting GOP victory in the 22 elections and promising that oversight of Hunter Biden's laptop and the claim that the federal government is treating moms and dads, like the ones in this room, like terrorists, would be the centerpiece of the GOP's work in the House when they got it back into power. Relaxing with a friendly interviewer, Chairman Jordan gave the game away entirely. Quote, "All those things need to be investigated just so you have the truth," he said. Plus, that will help frame up the 2024 race when I hope and I think President Trump is going to run, and we need to make sure that he wins. We need to make sure that he wins. This call to arms for the 2024 presidential election was met with wild applause from the CPAC audience. I urge every member of this subcommittee to go and watch the interview. Now, of course, a serious bipartisan committee focused on weaponization of the government would zero in quickly on the Trump administration itself, which brought weaponization to frightening new levels across the board. Consider just a few examples I have time for, illustrative of dozens I can provide the subcommittee. One, in a 6-week period in 2020, Donald Trump fired or removed 5 different departmental inspectors general simply for doing their jobs and not caving into Trump's coercive political demands to cover up different forms of administration wrongdoing and misconduct. April 3rd, 2020, Trump informed Congress he was firing Intelligence Community Inspector General Michael Atkinson, who had received a whistleblower complaint in August 2019 about improper demands made by Trump to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. In May 2020, Trump fired Steve Linick, IG of the State Department, later claiming he had no idea who he was and saying that he fired him only at Secretary Pompeo's request. That Inspector General was investigating Pompeo's decision to bypass Congress in sending billions of dollars in arms to Saudi Arabia. I don't have time to get into the details of the others, but May 20, he fired Mitch Bem, the transportation deputy IG. He relieved of duty Glenn Fine, acting IG for the Defense Department. He removed Christy Grimm, the acting Inspector General of HHS. Second, breaching the traditional separation between the President and Department of Justice criminal prosecutions, Trump and his obliging sycophantic attorney generals, like Jeff Sessions and William Barr, repeatedly pressured career prosecutors to go hard or go soft in particular cases, always seeking to reward Trump's friends or to punish his enemies. If weaponization of the Department of Justice has any meaning, this is it. Consider the egregious case of Gregory Craig, a White House counsel under Obama, who was targeted by the DOJ for alleged FARA violations and finally indicted on a single count of making false statements. He was acquitted unanimously by the jury in less than 5 hours, and one of his lawyers observed that the Department of Justice had hounded his client without any evidence and without any purpose. Former U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman said that Greg Craig never should have been prosecuted. Consider the case of Michael Cohen, the president's former lawyer and confidant for many years. In August 2018, he pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations over large hush money payments he arranged before the 2016 election to keep porn star Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal from talking about sexual affairs they had with Donald Trump. You guys remember this one? Well, after Barr became Attorney General in February of 2019, he worked to kill further investigations related to those payoffs and suggested that Mr. Cohen's conviction on campaign finance charges itself be reversed, even though 6 months had already passed since Cohen had entered a guilty plea. Amazingly, after Cohen was imprisoned for a year and then being transferred out of prison to home confinement during COVID-19, Barr and the DOJ intervened to block his transfer because Cohen would not immediately accept as a condition of his ankle bracelet home confinement not to engage in First Amendment activities, specifically writing and publishing a book about Donald Trump or saying anything in public on TV or in the social media about Donald Trump. Cohen had already been home for 2 weeks when this unconstitutional demand from DOJ appeared, and when he and his attorney dared to ask questions about it, 3 federal marshals showed up with handcuffs and shackles, and he was returned to the Otisville Correctional Institute. There he spent 16 days in solitary confinement before they were able to get his case before a federal district judge who immediately found that Barr's purpose, quote, in transferring Cohen from release on furlough and home confinement back to custody was retaliatory in response to Cohen desiring to exercise his First Amendment rights to publish a book critical of the president and to discuss the book on social media. Can you think of a more egregious example of weaponizing the Department of Justice for nakedly political purposes than imprisoning and putting in solitary confinement the president's own former lawyer simply because he wanted to exercise his First Amendment rights? Consider the John Durham investigation. At the urging of Republicans, including the good chairman, the John Durham Special Counsel investigation was set up in 2019 by Barr to try to find wrongdoing by intelligence or law enforcement agencies in the origins of the Mueller investigation. And we've heard some of the murmurings about this today. After 4 years and millions of dollars spent, the Durham investigation closed as a total flop without unearthing anything like the deep state conspiracy that Republicans have been denouncing around here for years. It couldn't find anything of substance to it. Yet Barr and Durham kept pressing in clearly abusive ways. I hope your subcommittee will investigate. One former DOJ prosecutor, Robert Luskin, a defense lawyer who represented 2 witnesses before the Durham probe, told the New York Times he was shocked. "This stuff had my head spinning," he said. When did these guys drink the Kool-Aid, and who served it to them? Amazingly, when prosecutors participating in this wild goose chase actually came into possession of evidence of a real offense from Italian government officials of a potentially major financial crime committed by Donald Trump, Durham was suddenly deputized to investigate it, and the whole investigation mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Trump's enablers now want this subcommittee not to examine the Durham debacle as a case study in dangerous weaponization of the justice function, but rather to pick up the baton from the defeated and demoralized Durham team and to keep the wild goose chase going today. Third, the former president had no qualms about literally weaponizing our nation's law enforcement and military against First Amendment activity for his political purposes. I commend to you the debacle that took place on June 1st, 2020 in Lafayette Square, where they mobilized an interagency law enforcement troop and then unleashed them on horseback with pepper spray and batons, billy clubs, rubber bullets against a totally lawfully present crowd. Mr. Chairman, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that any of the investigations that have taken place during the last 2 years have been perfect. I'm sure they could have been improved in some ways. That's a legit thing for you to ask. But it's one thing to engage in systematic oversight driven by a commitment to facts and the truth, and something radically different to set up a platform for a series of hit-and-run partisan attacks that are just vindictive, vendetta-driven, and meant to frame up a presidential campaign in 2024. And some of the new rhetoric we've been hearing can be dangerous, as the ranking member was pointing out. After the execution of a perfectly lawful judicial search warrant in Palm Beach in August of last year, politicians and media figures began denouncing the FBI, the whole FBI and FBI agents in vitriolic terms. And since then, the FBI and DHS have observed an increase in violent threats posted on social media against federal officials and facilities, including a threat to place a dirty bomb in front of FBI headquarters and issuing general calls for civil war and armed rebellion. And we've heard those calls before in this chamber. On August 11th, last year, a person wearing a technical vest and armed with an AR-style rifle and nail gun attempted to forcibly enter the FBI Cincinnati field office. When officers responded, he fled the scene and a pursuit followed. During a prolonged standoff with the FBI, the man fired multiple shots at Ohio State Highway Patrol. Mr. Chairman, the public is skeptical about this strange new venture with the strange new name that's being launched, because so many of the members involved have done everything they can to block the January 6th committee's investigation of the worst insurrectionary domestic violent attack on an American election in the American Congress in our history. And the public wonders whether members who refuse to comply with congressional subpoenas themselves should be issuing congressional subpoenas to other people. Oversight must be organized around a comprehensive search for the truth that will lead to progress, and not around revenge, which will lead us as a country to chaos and ruin. I hope the subcommittee will find a way to embark upon a truly bipartisan agenda with all members participating and agreeing on a common agenda, and I wish you well and Godspeed on behalf of this difficult venture that you are about to proceed on.
Thankfully, have not had to do. And I'm also troubled, I'm deeply troubled by all of the events, as well as the increase in violence and threats of violence against civil servants and federal law enforcement as we attempt to weaponize these individuals doing their job. In fact, we've seen the consequences of this rhetoric over and over again. I'm also deeply troubled by the idea of Congress, as I said in my opening statement, using oversight as a weapon to air a list of political grievances. We seem to hear much of that from the first panel, especially. I've been a member of the House Oversight Committee, where I saw firsthand how good oversight can help Congress make better public policy. Mr. Williams, you've worked in both Congress and the executive branch. Do you agree with me that oversight of the federal government is an important legislative process?
Absolutely. As Representative Raskin said at the first panel, the Constitution doesn't explicitly lay out an oversight mandate, but the legislative mandate of Congress provides Congress with its ability to engage in oversight. Oversight is good when it helps the government work better.
Thank you. Do you agree that congressional oversight is at its best when it's focused on addressing the real problems that Americans face on every day?
The real problems Americans face every day and making government work better. Absolutely, Congresswoman.
I believe in congressional oversight, and committee Democrats would be willing to work together to conduct oversight of matters such as the disproportionate audits by the IRS of African American families. Recent reports about former Attorney General Bill Barr and Special Counsel John Durham. Mr. Williams, do you agree that congressional oversight works best when it's bipartisan in nature?
Absolutely.
And have you seen examples of that in bipartisan investigations?
Oh, absolutely.
I know that it's so infrequent now, but have you ever seen any?
Absolutely. A great example is in 2016 when the House Committee on Oversight, led by Republican Chairman Jason Chaffetz and Ranking Member Elijah Cummings, worked together on an investigation, a bipartisan investigation of the United States Secret Service and mismanagement and misbehavior there. It led to bipartisan legislation that made, as I said, the government work better and Secret Service a more functional organization.
What about cooperation between the branches of government? Is it necessary for Congress to be willing to work with the executive branch in investigations?
Yes, and vice versa. Absolutely. The executive branch should be willing to work with Congress as well.
And would that first instance be trying to come to agreement as to when and how documents and information could be given?
Absolutely. The public sees hearings, but does not see that when the process works properly, there's a back and forth and a give and take between the two parties at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, as I said before.
Would you say 2 weeks into the Congress issuing subpoenas might be a bit premature for the investigation and cooperation between those branches of government?
Certainly, Congresswoman, Congress has the authority to issue subpoenas quickly if they wish, but I guess you get more flies with honey than with vinegar, to be cute. And working with the other side collaboratively is always going to be a better approach.
Vinegar seems to work better on social media, though, than the honey. I yield back.
I think the gentlelady, I would just point out, we tried the honey. 100 letters we sent in the last Congress. We tried the honey.
The last Congress, you're now the chair.
The honey didn't work.
You're now
That's
in
why
the
we sent
majority. You
subpoenas.
should have tried that first as the chair of this committee, not as the ranking member.
We tried. We
You didn't
tried
do
with
that
100
as
and some
chairman.
letters.
You didn't.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of Wyoming, Ms. Hageman.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan. It is a privilege to serve on this select subcommittee, and I look forward to the work we have ahead of us. After over 30 years as a water, natural resource, and constitutional attorney, I have seen firsthand and fought against
of threats, but what we're concerned about in the scope of this committee is the fear of threats to the American citizens. The reason we use the term weaponization is because it is appropriate. We have so many examples of that across so many federal agencies that were designed to serve and protect the American people and have been used in recent years against them, that it will take us probably 2 years to lay that out. But I just want to focus on one that's been mentioned this morning because the timeline is important. The school boards issue. On June 22nd, 2021, Loudoun County parent Scott Smith spoke out at his local school board meeting and he was arrested. On September 29th, citing Mr. Smith's arrest as an example, the National School Boards Association sent a letter to the Biden administration requesting federal law enforcement involvement in local school board disputes. Now, here's what's really important. We learned later that the White House helped the NSBA draft that letter to itself. On October 4th, Attorney General Merrick Garland issued the now infamous memo directing federal law enforcement to mobilize against the parents of school children who protest at their local school board meetings. He turned the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the full weight of the Federal Department of Justice against the very citizens they were sworn to defend and protect. On October 12th, we learned that the Loudoun County parent Scott Smith's daughter was actually sexually assaulted at her school and that the school board covered it up, and that was the reason why that dad showed up to protest. 9 days later, October 21st, happened to be the day previously scheduled for Attorney General Merrick Garland himself to appear before our House Judiciary Committee. In that hearing, as my colleagues will remember, he was forced to acknowledge before our committee that the NSBA letter was the basis of his memo targeting concerned parents. But he refused to acknowledge the obvious chilling effect that memo, involving the full weight of the federal law enforcement apparatus, would have on parents' protected First Amendment speech. He also, by the way, refused to commit to a mandatory, under federal law, mandatory ethics review of his own family's financial ties to advancing critical race theory in schools and its relation to his school board memo and the obvious appearance of the conflict of interest therein. I encourage all interested citizens to watch the video of that hearing. It was pretty contentious. The very next day, on October 22nd, after much public outcry, the NSBA retracted and publicly apologized for its letter labeling concerned parents like Scott Smith as, quote, domestic terrorists. In the following weeks, over 20 different state school board associations severed their ties with the National School Boards Association. Our Democrat colleagues have tried to downplay the importance of this select committee and even criticized its name as hyperbolic. But as this example and so many others clearly show, key agencies have indeed been weaponized. We're informed even still today that that memo has not been retracted by the Attorney General. Here's the question, Mr. Baker. You were an FBI agent for 33 years and were involved in a lot of the important and noble work there, but you've also said clearly and been vocal about some of the egregious overreaches you've seen from the FBI and the DOJ. In recent years, you've described what has devolved into a culture of, quote, deceit and deception involving, quote, alarming FBI behavior, and you've written that those abuses threaten the liberties of those on the left as well as the right. Professor Turley just cited statistics here today that there are large numbers of Americans who now distrust the FBI. Our task here is to determine exactly how that's happened and how to correct that framework. Mr. Baker, here's the question. In your testimony, you noted that FBI Director Mueller, a couple of decades ago, worked to centralize the FBI, meaning that he centralized all information and decision-making, making that at the FBI headquarters, as opposed to his predecessor's decentralized model, which empowered the field offices instead. Do you believe the elimination of all those layers of supervision, review, and independent judgment is a key reason for all this corruption we see today, and that it's something that must be reformed and reversed?
Yes, in fact, I do.
Hit that button for me, if you will.
Yes, in fact, I do, Congressman. I don't use the term corruption. The term I think is more appropriate that your colleague, Congresswoman Stefanik, used, the rotten culture, the culture rot. And specifically as regards to centralization, there's no question about it. Traditionally in the FBI, field agent had an investigation. He had a field supervisor above him. Above him was the agent in charge of that office. Only then did the information and the decision-making go to FBI headquarters. What happened under Mueller's centralized thing, all of that was eliminated. They ran these key investigations, the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and then the Trump collusion investigation, out of headquarters, eliminated all these layers of independent judgment, supervision, gone. So you had someone like, somebody mentioned his name already here, Strzok not only writes the communication opening the case, he goes the next day to London and conducts the first interview in the case. You have McCabe, a deputy director, number 2 in the whole Bureau, directs the investigation and sends 2 agents to the White House to interview General Flynn. No levels of review. It was bound to end badly.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Yeah, they had a name for it. It's called a headquarters special. And the point is, it wasn't special so much, it became the norm. With that, the chair now recognizes...
Mr. Chairman, could I have a point of order? There have been a lot of mention of information and testimony that you all have received from whistleblowers. When are you planning on providing that to the minority?
You could have been for the very first deposition, or excuse me, transcribed interview of the whistleblower. I was there when he testified on Tuesday.
Okay, that's fine. I assume you'll turn those over. But what about, you talk about dozens of whistleblowers. When are we going to get that information?
When they testify, when we work with, I'll work with the ranking member on that information.
You don't have any transcriptions of their interviews?
We have the first one, and we have the dozens who come and talk to our office.
They talk to your office privately?
They talk to Republican staff, right.
And they're not transcribed, no notes, no nothing?
The first one happened Tuesday.
No, I'm not talking about the first one.
The first one happened Tuesday, the
dozens.
next one happens tomorrow, the third one happens next Wednesday, and we'll continue to do that.
You just said dozens. Do you have notes from those, or they're just talking to you, your staff?
Mr. Chairman, isn't that how whistleblowers typically work?
People feel like this government wasn't so weaponized against them if there wasn't such a revolving door between Department of Justice senior officials and lobbying?
I don't quite follow the premise of your question, sir.
It's pretty easy. There's a revolving door between senior officials at the DOJ and the lobbying profession. Do you think that that gives the public more or less trust?
There are rules governing what employment, and this is based on my understanding, I've been government for 15 years, governing what post-government employment can be. One, what individuals' actions can be once they're employed elsewhere, but also what they're allowed to do.
Lobbying is influence peddling, and you are the principal at the Rabin Group, which is a lobbying firm. And I would observe the reporting of Project Veritas, where Jordan Tristan Walker, who's a director of research and development, said on a recording, one of the things we're exploring is like, why don't we just manipulate COVID ourselves, mutate COVID via directed evolution? Pfizer is a revolving door for all government officials. It's pretty good for industry, to be honest. It's bad for everyone else in America. Pfizer is one of the clients of the lobbying firm that you're a principal of, isn't it?
I do not represent Pfizer. I do not know, sir.
You're a principal of the Rabin Group, right?
No, that is correct. I mean,
Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the clients of the Rabin Group, which include Pfizer.
Without objection.
Not just Pfizer, but Google as well. And in response to the Twitter files, we saw a statement come from the FBI where they said correspondence between the FBI and Twitter show nothing more than examples of our traditional, long-standing, and ongoing federal government and private sector engagements. Are there such engagements between the FBI and Google?
When you say such engagements, sir, I don't quite
Does Google engage with the FBI, Mr. Williams?
I don't work for either Google or the FBI, sir.
I'd have to again point you to your own client list that you advertise on your own website, which includes Google. Does it surprise you that at the Rabin Group's website, Pfizer and Google are clients?
It does not surprise me, sir, no.
The Soros-funded Open Society is one of the clients as well. Does that surprise you?
Sir, I don't have our client list in front of me right now. I will, assuming that's what it says, I will take your word for it.
Yeah, I would think that maybe one of the legislative initiatives we could pursue would be to tighten this revolving door that folks at Pfizer and folks at Big Tech seem to freely acknowledge, in which you seem to be the incarnate of the revolving door. Mr. Baker and Ms. Parker, I want to assure you both that we come not to trash the FBI, but to rescue the FBI from political capture. And it seems as though that political capture was really enhanced when Robert Mueller took a lot of the authority and power away from the field offices all over our country and centralized that power. Mr. Baker, do you believe that through legislation we might be able to restore the system of office origin, where events occur, people are able to conduct investigations in the absence of the influences of Washington, D.C.?
There's no doubt Congress can be an advocate. You're doing a lot of good by having these hearings, this panel. A lot of these things, though, have to be done internally by the DOJ and the FBI. But there's absolutely a role for Congress, looking at the abuses of Pfizer for one, the abuses of the unmasking for another, the abuses of the indirect targeting, which actually the CIA and the NSA do rather than the FBI. But these are all things Congress can legislate solutions to.
And it seems as though those abuses become more acute the greater they have a geographic proximity to Washington, D.C. Seems we don't see these abuses with the brave FBI agents like Ms. Parker, who I'm very grateful served my fellow Floridians in the Miami field office. Ms. Parker, if we got the decision-making more out of Washington, D.C. and into the hands of our field offices where we have so many patriotic and brave FBI officials, do you think we'd be able to escape this political capture that quite literally drove you out of the Bureau?
I think that's absolutely critical at this point in our American history. When I mentioned in the opening statement is if there are two FBIs, we in the FBI see it as the field offices, the standard rank and file. We are typically the agents who just came to the FBI to serve the country, protect American citizens, fight crime. We have no interest in politics. We really have no interest in promoting many times. And then FBI 2 is kind of more individuals that are at the headquarters level and sometimes
Well, it seems
executive roles.
as though that politics isn't out in the field offices. It's here in Washington, D.C., and that's precisely what we ought to deconstruct legislatively. I thank the witnesses, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Williams, do you want to take about 30 seconds to respond?
It won't even take 30 seconds, Congressman. What I would say is if we're talking today about what's within Congress's powers and duties under Article 1 of the Constitution, one such thing is legislation. If Congress wishes to pass bipartisan legislation either about the Federal Elections Commission or lobbying requirements, have at it. That is Congress's role, and work together and do it. I would support it, and I'm sure many people in this room would.
Alas, our first bipartisan agreement.
We're in agreement there, I think.
Reclaiming my time.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Not from you. Thank you. First, I want to thank you, Ms. Parker. As a victim of the Cesar Sayoc bomb package case, along with my staff, I appreciate your service and the work that you did in the Miami Bureau. Mr. Williams, you worked in oversight for a long time, as you noted, in Congress for the executive branch. You've seen it at its best and worst. And although the Judiciary Committee has issued subpoenas over unfounded accusations just 2 weeks into this Congress, I know I have serious concerns over their rush to judgment, like many other committee actions that are employed by Republicans for purely political reasons. But their move also clearly shows that when Republicans are in charge, they use the levers of power to weaponize government. So can you tell us some examples of congressional oversight that has been abused in that way?
Well, what I will say, Congresswoman, is that when congressional oversight is abused, history doesn't treat it well. And none of us today are the judge or the guide, but history will be. And if, for instance, individuals are targeted, history will not be the judge of that if Congress is using its authorities to do so and overstep its bounds beyond the scope of its Article 1 authority.
Thank you. And what can members of Congress learn from past examples of the politicization of oversight?
I think past is prologue, and by recognizing that with a large platform as Congress has, it has the tremendous ability to harm people as much as it does to do good. And Congress ought to perhaps have that in mind when thinking about how to make government work better.
Thank you. In 2015, a member of Congress who happens to currently hold the gavel now in the House boasted that the Benghazi Select Committee was effective all because it hurt Hillary Clinton politically, saying, quote, "Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? But we put together a Benghazi Special Committee, a select committee. What are her numbers today?" Unquote. He even bragged in the same statement that because of it, her, quote, "numbers are dropping," unquote. During Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, Republicans held 9 investigative hearings focusing on her, including one where they called her to testify for over 11 hours. That was clearly politicized and weaponized oversight. And frankly, this weaponization committee itself epitomizes the weaponization of government. So, Mr. Williams, is it ever appropriate to turn congressional oversight authority into a weapon to harm a political opponent?
No.
And how can the politicization of congressional oversight harm the credibility of future congressional investigations?
That's exactly the point I was going to get to, Congressman. If the public loses its faith in Congress's ability to be a fair arbiter of oversight disputes, then what does Congress have ultimately? So yes, this is about the integrity of Congress, I think.
Thank you so much. Mr. Turley, turning to you, have you ever worked for Twitter?
No.
Do you have any formal relationship with the company?
No, I just have an account.
Do you have any specific or special or unique knowledge about the inner workings of Twitter?
Nothing beyond the Twitter files and what I read in the media.
So essentially, your responses to the questions here today were your own opinion and pure conjecture.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I try to base them on what we know from the Twitter files.
Well, but you said that you don't have any specific or unique knowledge of Twitter, but you spoke as if you did. You were asked very specific questions about Twitter's, the way Twitter functions and the decision-making that they make, but yet you don't have any unique or special knowledge about Twitter and have never worked for them. And so this is only just your opinion, would you say, as a Twitter account user?
No, I've come to give legal analysis based on facts that are in the public domain, and I was really referring to what I was asked about the Twitter files.
Reclaiming my time, legal analysis is another word for opinion.
I would think there is some distinction, but yeah, it ultimately is an opinion. But I believe the question to me was based on what the Twitter files show, and that was my reading of the Twitter files.
Right. And again, that's another way of describing your opinion being offered, which was represented as unique and special fact, which you don't possess. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Mr. Chairman, before he goes, may I be recognized for unanimous consent?
Oh, I apologize. Yeah, gentleman's recognized for unanimous consent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a Republican staff report from the Committee on the Judiciary dated November 4th, 2022, entitled FBI Whistleblowers, What...
Being called worse.
And it did not take 15 rounds of voting to do it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our ranking member for her steadfast leadership in pursuing truth and protecting our democracy. The federal government has a long history of weaponizing its power against minorities like communities of color, religious minorities, and immigrant communities. Women, Latinos, people of color, and religious minorities are the actual victims of a weaponized government, not billionaires or politicians with frail egos. House Democrats spent 4 years fighting to enhance civil rights and liberties and stop the weaponization of government against our most vulnerable communities. Now my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have assembled this misnamed and misguided committee to grandstand and to try to lecture us all on the weaponization of government. But the American people know that this committee and MAGA Republicans are all about all show and no substance, or as we say in Texas, all hat and no cattle. This committee is designed to inject extremist politics into the justice system and to shield the MAGA movement from the legal consequences of their actions. These political stunts undermine every agent, officer, prosecutor, law enforcement, and the entire justice system. We should instead dedicate some time to oversee direct interference in prosecutions and investigations. We should instead dedicate our efforts to investigating the abuse of power, the president's pardon power by the former twice impeached president. We should instead dedicate time and efforts to investigate the weaponization of the federal government to undermine and overturn the 2020 presidential election. I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we will have follow-up hearings to do some of that. Now I ask for unanimous consent to enter a letter from Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, outlining these and other recommendations for this committee into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the assault on the Capitol, which we've already discussed, many of us, including myself, were removed from the floor and evacuated. A lot of things happened, and I, for one, consider it more than just a riot. Some have suggested that this committee may try to erase the truth about the horrible days of that event. The idea of denying the truth about January 6th is horribly offensive to me, and I'm sure that it's even more offensive to the law enforcement officers who were on duty that day. Mr. Williams, I know you're familiar with that day, and you're familiar with the halls of Congress. You worked on the Hill, correct?
I did, Congresswoman, thanks.
Were you there on the Hill on January 6th?
I was not present on the Hill on January 6th.
Do you know others who were?
I certainly do.
Can you understand why it would be offensive to the people who were there, many like me who were on the floor and got pulled out, had to try to put on a gas mask and told to hit the floor? And of course, the many law enforcement officers who had to rise to the duty. Can you figure any way that we can defend this if anyone tries to rewrite what happened that day?
It's the second part of your sentence that I want to pick up on, Congressman, because it's not just former colleagues and friends of mine that were here. It is law enforcement officers that I know, and there simply is no place for threats against law enforcement in a civil society. So, I will echo everything you said. It was real. 1,000 people have been charged with crimes. Several have been convicted of very serious crimes. It was a real event.
So what is your reaction to the politicization of January the 6th?
I think, as a general matter, Congress works at its best when working in a bipartisan manner, and I think that becomes even more acute when talking about violent crime or threats or terrorism, as the word was used here, or even acts of insurrection.
Right, so you do agree that it is domestic terrorism?
And my former federal prosecutor friend at the end, we'd share this. There's no domestic federal terrorism statute. I want to be careful in how I talk about that. Now, certainly, there are acts that comprise what would constitute terrorism, violent crimes, and so on, that might fit under that definition. And another thing for Congress to consider, if it wishes to, is to pass a domestic terrorism statute.
All right, are any of the investigations contemplated by this subcommittee comparable to the scale to the investigation of the attack of the Capitol?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the question, Congressman.
Are any of the investigations contemplated by this subcommittee comparable in scale to the investigation into the attack of the Capitol?
You know, I'm not certain as to what the committee's full mandate is, but to be clear, what happened on the day of the Capitol was a historic event that ought never happen again, and perhaps it's in Congress's interest to work toward that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I can actually answer that question. This committee is different in the sense that we allowed our minority party to appoint their representatives to the panel. So we'll start there. Examining the ways that the federal government abuses its power when dealing with everyday citizens it sees as threatening is some of the most powerful and consequential work that a member of Congress can do. During this federal government's very first Congress, the representatives in the House began granting authorities to federal agencies. These members were well experienced in the growth and abuses of a tyrannical government. The inherent quality of all governments is to collect more power and authority. But there is an inverse relationship to the power of government and the freedom of the individual. That is why James Madison, along with other like-minded members of the House, as well as President Washington, encouraged the passage of a Bill of Rights, defined, enumerated rights that citizens of our new nation could point to when governments begin to trifle with their lives, their businesses, or their faith. They passed the Bill of Rights in the first session of the first Congress, arguably the most important action ever done by this body for the American people. Their actions were revolutionary. No government on earth has a founding document that has aged as well as ours. It is the oldest and least amended Constitution in the world. And what we are charged to do on this committee is defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to ensure that our citizens' life, liberty, and property are protected from the warrantless abuses of federal bureaus and their agents. Today, we are answering the call to investigate and ultimately stop the litany of dangerous and unconstitutional actions. Truthfully, the list is exhausting, and I'm sure that there is far more that we can address here today, or even in the 2 years that we have. So while Washington, Madison, and Jefferson are no longer here to help guide us in this body, their spirit lives on. It is absolutely crucial that we today take up this mantle. It is the work that will be done by this committee, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as Americans, that is important and will live on. Mr. Williams, you just told this committee to be cute, quote, "You get more flies with honey than vinegar." On your Twitter feed, you called the January 6th Select Committee to publicly hammer and shame former Deputy Attorney General Jeff Clark on everything that he attempts to plead the Fifth about. Is that your version of honey or vinegar?
That's my version of stating when an individual has provided.
No, just honey or vinegar.
I don't think it's a binary.
Okay.
If you look at the
all right.
context of all of my tweets.
You also just told Representative Sanchez a few minutes ago that one of the hallmarks of good oversight is bipartisan, and it's designed to, quote, improve government process, end quote. You went on to say that threats are not protected speech. You yourself were extraordinarily critical of Justice Brett Kavanaugh, going so far as to say publicly on your Twitter feed, and you were not shadow banned, however, but when you said this, that the FBI dropped the ball when vetting him. When there was an assassination attempt on his life, you were unusually quiet. Up to that point, you had tweeted about him 17 times. I hope you, along with our Democratic colleagues, would agree that violence in political discourse is unacceptable, and I would encourage you to do better. That's the statement, not a question. Moving on, Professor Turley, the Constitution was written to limit the power of the federal government and to protect the rights of citizens, yes or no?
Yes.
You've written extensively about the abuses of the federal government. Would you say that these abuses occur within a variety of different agencies, yes or no?
Yes.
Are there not massive national security implications as a result of the extensive amount of warrantless data collection by the federal government agencies, coupled with the disastrous track record that they have of leaks and breaches, that Americans are not only being targeted domestically by the agencies, but also by bad actors and foreign actors?
Well, there are massive constitutional concerns there with the collection of data. There's no question about that.
But with all the breaches and leaks,
Yes,
there is a national security
separate
implication,
problem.
is there not?
There can be.
Thank you. It is publicly documented the reference of use of force capabilities within a litany of different agencies, including the Department of Education, the IRS, HHS, even the EPA. Can you detail why the capability, coupled with extensive warrantless data collection efforts of these agencies, should concern everyday Americans, and why agencies like the Department of Education and the EPA are purchasing millions of dollars worth of ammunition and tactical ballistic gear?
Well, I testified earlier on the use of national security letters and other means to get information below the warrant level. And that covers a huge amount of information that the government has gathered. And I thought there was actually fairly bipartisan support on that Democratic and Republican members were equally concerned about the circumvention of warrants in that sense. I think it's a very serious problem. And to the credit of social media companies, they actually have pushed back on this. I mean, one of the things in the Twitter files that I noted was that some of that dealt with these types of efforts to get access to social media companies. But most of the time, these companies are really hamstrung when they get these letters, and there's a lot of them, to turn over this information. And citizens are unaware of that. And a lot of what we have that we could hold most dearly in terms of private information is now on our cell phones, it's now on the cloud. And the government has really targeted the cloud. I mean, they're going after the cloud with non-warrants. And in the previous hearing, I was really gladdened because Democrats and Republicans joined together and said, this is a problem. And I think it still is a problem.
I appreciate it. My time has expired. I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a committee menacingly called the weaponization of the federal government. Mr. Turley, have you ever worked for the federal government?
Yes.
What did you do?
I did a couple of years off and on with the NSA as a lowly intern. I also worked in the legislative branch in various capacities. I represented Congress in court.
But that's not working for the federal government. You were an intern.
Well,
okay.
No, I wasn't an intern. I was representing them.
I understand. You were an intern at NSA. That's the extent of your federal government experience.
No,
right?
I think Congress is part of the federal government. And
you represented Congress. You didn't work for Congress.
Well, they paid me. That's my standard. Okay. But also, I also worked for.
All right, I want to reclaim my time. Let's move on because I have a lot to cover. You've commented a lot on the First Amendment today. Do you think that Special Counsel Mueller's indictment of members of Russian intelligence for interfering with the 2016 election through social media was improperly charged?
Well, it depends. I have to look at which case you're talking about, but I supported Mueller's appointment as special counsel.
I'm talking about the indictment.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, I don't remember being upset with those indictments. Okay.
But well, what they did and what they alleged is that Russia interfered in our election through using speech via social media.
Right.
Now, do you think that the First Amendment protects people from making death threats against federal officials across state lines?
No. If it's a
Does the First Amendment protect someone from yelling fire in a movie theater?
Well, unfortunately, that one is not yes or no, because that's become a mantra for people. It's the Holmes Schenck line. Holmes himself walked back on that.
All right.
Holmes and
we don't need a law class here. But you do agree, though, don't you, that the First Amendment does not protect all speech?
No, there are limits to speech. All constitutional rights have limits.
Right. Mr. Baker, I want to turn to you. When did you retire from the FBI?
I retired from FBI employment in about 20 years ago. And
1999, right? It's a year.
Yeah, and I've continued to be engaged with the FBI on a number of levels since then.
Okay. So you retired 2 years before 9/11, right?
That's correct.
All right. And are you aware that one of the reasons that 9/11 occurred was that the FBI and the intelligence community did not coordinate sufficiently? Would you agree with that?
that's a conclusion of the September 11th Commission, and it's very valid, I think.
And so you read that like I did, and that's all the information that you had, because you were
Yes.
not at the FBI.
And
And
what's
as a result of 9/11, that the Department of Homeland Security was created, right?
a year or two after that, yes.
So you never worked in conjunction with the Department of Homeland Security when you worked for the FBI, right?
I was working as a consultant during
When
most
you
of
worked
those
for the
years.
FBI, when you were paid by the FBI as a special agent, did you work with Homeland Security?
No, it didn't exist.
Okay. And you never investigated foreign interference in our elections, did you?
No, I personally did not.
And you have no experience investigating Russia's efforts to interfere in our elections through cyber attacks and social media, do you?
Other than what I've studied and researched.
Okay. And in 1999, when you left, did smartphones exist?
Of a sort.
Really?
Yes.
What?
Well, we had phones. We had phones in
Smartphones.
cars.
Do you know
We
what
had-
a smartphone
we had,
is? Okay.
Well,
Did you ever do any search warrants for emails?
search warrants for
Emails.
No, I did not.
Did you ever investigate domestic extremism?
Actually, yes. I investigated the Ku Klux Klan on many occasions.
Good.
I would
Did
call
you ever
those-
investigate any insurrections on the Capitol?
No, there was none.
Okay. And I appreciate that your service, sir, but you would agree that a lot has changed in the FBI in the 23 years since you left, correct?
Good and bad, and I have stayed engaged on a number of levels.
One last question, sir, for you. I read that your opening statement is actually an excerpt from your book. Is that right?
Well, it covers some of the same territory, yes.
All right. Well, next time, make sure you give us a heads up and we can set up a table for you to have a book signing after this. Ms. Parker, real quick, do you think that you speak for, you said that Americans are concerned about the FBI. Do you think you speak for every American?
I do not speak for every American, but as a special agent who's been out in the field trying to conduct my job, it's very difficult when we don't have the buy-in of the American people, and a lot of Americans do not trust the FBI anymore because of recent...
Well, unfortunately, my time is about up, but I will also say to you that I worked in the Department of Justice for 10 years alongside a lot of FBI special agents. And their biggest concern and the most damage to the morale of the FBI occurred after Donald Trump started attacking the FBI because he was being investigated by the FBI. And that is what this subcommittee is all about. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I disagree with his conclusion. We will now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Shouting fire in a crowded theater was dicta in a 1919 case by Schenck. It was overruled in 1969.